All right, welcome everybody to another live developer cast here on the Game Wisdom YouTube channel. For tonight's talk, we're going to be discussing art and design with returning guests and owner of Off Script Games, Brian Cronin.
Thanks for having me on.
Hey Brian, it's great to talk to you again. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well.
Hopefully you survived Black Friday and Cyber Monday and all that stuff this past week.
Yeah, I mostly avoid that kind of stuff, but I was aware of it happening.
I got through relatively unscathed. At least I kept my spending under $100, so I consider that to be a minor success.
Yeah, the Steam sale definitely got me a little bit. I probably put about $10 into the Steam sale, so I wasn't completely unscathed.
Well, you certainly beat me, though, that's for sure. But we certainly have a lot to talk about tonight. And like I said, for those of you watching this either live or recorded, we did speak to Brian. Again, it feels like it's been like a year or so. I think it was like earlier in 2017, right?
Yeah, maybe not quite a year, but close to it, I'm sure.
Yep. And we're finally starting to wrap up 2017. We're only a few days away from December, which of course means Game of the Years and all that great stuff. So I guess I know this may still be a little too early, but do you have any picks for your personal Game of the Year?
Ooh, that's a tough question.
Rather you than me.
I don't play a great number of games. I play a few games and really focus on them. So I'm trying to think what I put a lot of time into this year. Factorio is something that I think I've been playing it for about 2 years now, and I don't know if I'd call it game of the year, but it's definitely one of the games of every year because it's fantastic. I also tried Pulsar recently, which is a cooperative spaceship simulator game like Star Trek. I wouldn't call it game of anything yet because it's still pretty early on, but it's developing well and I think shows a lot of promise. Those are a couple that come to mind immediately.
Mm-hmm. And for me, I always have trouble with these Game of the Year lists because I always forget all the games that came out in the year.
Well, at least you have recordings of everything you're playing, right? You can go through and look at all the games you've played.
Yeah, but then I have to be careful because I'm usually late to a lot of games, so I'll pick like a game that came out like 2, 3 years ago, and I'll go, damn, it came out in 2015. I gotta rewrite this whole list.
I still include it, whatever.
All right, so for people watching this who may have missed our last podcast or don't know who you are, Brian, could you talk a little bit about your background when it comes to the game industry?
Sure, yeah. So I've been working in the game industry for I think about 13 years now, if I have that right, at least professionally. And I started off with cell phones before the iPhone even, moved into my own independent game called Zero Gear, which is kind of a go-kart game we released on Steam, and worked for quite a few number of years on a game called Natural Selection 2. So I did programming on all these games. Contributed some basic design work to Zero Gear because it was just me and one other guy. So for the most part, we had some help towards the end. And yes, I've worked on a ton of side projects as well. Right now, I'm working on a card game. So it's a physical card game called One Last Job. It's a heist game where both players are doing slightly different things. So you kind of have the crew on the one side, which is similar to an Ocean's 11 style movie, and they're trying to pull off a heist. And on the other side, you have what we call the powers, or the powers that be, and they're trying to push forward their kind of influence in the world while avoiding getting everything stolen from them at the same time. So it's an asymmetric game, asymmetric card game, and we're building out a Kickstarter campaign for that now. So we're kind of past the design stage of the game. The game is, I want to call it design complete, but very near. Building out a lot of artwork and working on a video, getting everything put together to get a Kickstarter page up as soon as possible.
Cool. I know when we last spoke, you were, I think, still early in the design phase. I guess, so remind me, Brian, how many players is One Last Job going to be built for?
Sure, yeah, so it's a strictly two-player game, so two-player asymmetric. Each game takes roughly, I'd say 20 to 30 minutes to play, but it can take longer. Just depends a lot on how the players understand the game. Like the first game of it's going to take longer. That's pretty common in a card game. Yeah, and aesthetically, it's kind of a comic book type of look. I'd say like a 90s comic look is kind of what we're going for. Yeah.
Cool. And as you said, this is your first time designing a tabletop card game, correct?
Yeah, at least to the extent of releasing it. I've put a lot of time in the past into little experiments that I just kind of play with my partner, with friends, and don't take it beyond maybe a couple iterations. So this is definitely the first time taking it seriously and thinking of it commercially and thinking about how do we actually produce this thing and all of those kind of questions.
Hmm. And for those of you who missed our last cast, I know that you're a big fan of the tabletop or I think collectible card game Netrunner. And
Yes.
we talked about that as well as card game design last time on the podcast.
Yeah, I've been playing Netrunner now for 5 years. The game came out in late 2012, and I remember playing it during the Thanksgiving break of 2012. So just over 5 years, I've been playing that one pretty competitively. I take it pretty seriously, too seriously. It's not a huge game, but it has a good following, and I've made a lot of friends through that game. So it's really a fantastic card game, a good entry point into the hobby if you're at all interested in collectible and what they call living card games.
Hmm. And our last time we definitely spoke a lot about some of the challenges of designing like a collectible or even just a tabletop card game. And for those of you who missed that cast, I'll include a link to it in the description below when this gets uploaded or archived. But I guess with a game like One Last Shot, like bringing it to that, what has been, like, I guess, any like interesting design considerations or challenges when it comes to building that as a tabletop experience?
It's a really good question. I'd say so. One of our design goals with One Last Job was the best way to describe it is you have a game like Magic, which I think everyone's at least familiar with, who's probably watching this right now. And it's not an overly complicated game, but there's when you get a lot of cards in there, a lot of effects stacked up on top of each other. There's a lot of priority passing of players being able to interrupt each other. All these things build up into a really rich experience. And then you look at a game like Hearthstone, which has taken I think what makes Magic tick and has distilled it down into the essence and has made it something that you can play on the internet against people, and it works really well. So they've taken a lot of design, they've used a lot of design constraints to achieve that. That was the initial goal with One Last Job, was to take card games that aren't just about fighting creatures versus creatures, which I'd say is the majority of card games, but taking card games that have different goals and different ways to interact with the cards and the other player across the table. And so our main inspiration for that was Netrunner, and it was taking some of the feelings you get playing Netrunner and some of the ways that you play Netrunner that are distinct from a game like Magic, and trying to distill it down, because Netrunner is a very complicated game, maybe more so than Magic in some ways. So it was really our original goal was to release this on Steam, on the PC, as a digital card game, and really distill down what makes Netrunner tick as a game, and share that with hopefully a lot more people. So we decided it was probably smarter to release it on Kickstarter as a physical game first. That I don't know if that answers your question, but it's kind of that's a broad, high level kind of design we had in mind while working on this game.
All right. So as you said, it's going to be going on Kickstarter first, or it's going to be a physical version first. Are you
Right.
planning to do a digital version in the future?
It's something I would like to do. At this point, it very much depends on the response to the game. So I'm hoping people like it. I'm hoping people contribute to the Kickstarter and try it out and play it. And I want to get into a dialogue with folks and really build out a community around this game. And I would like to do it. It's something that would require a pretty big investment of time and money to make it happen. So I kind of need to see if people are even interested in this first, which that's kind of where the physical copy comes in.
Yeah. And speaking about developing it as a physical element to it, one of the challenges of like tabletop games, especially tabletop compared to digital, is obviously when it comes to updating or growing it. Obviously, with a PC game, if you need to add a new card or update text, it's sending out a patch for everyone on Steam or everyone with your client. when you're dealing with a tabletop, you mess up or if you need to change things, it's a whole new printing of your game in some cases. And I guess with that said, especially with the idea of the card-based design, how do you come up with like all the various cards that you want to include in your game? Because again, once you've sent this off to printing, that's it. There's no do-overs at that point.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So I guess there's two parts there. Like card design in general, where do the ideas come from? What shapes the cards,
Yeah.
and then the kind of digital versus physical patch almost. And I guess in terms of that, in terms of patching, we're pretty small right now. It's me and my partner, business partner Adam, working on this. And so I'm kind of in the agile space. If we make a mistake or if a card needs balancing, we can post that on the internet in various ways and encourage people to play with the new text. That's kind of an errata. Erratas are very common in physical card games. Magic does it. Netrunner does it quite often. So that happens, and I think players are totally fine with that at this point. So I'm not too worried about pivoting once it's printed. And I am also a very detail-oriented person, so I'm very confident we won't have any major mistakes in at least the printing. The game balance, I'm fairly confident about. We've done a lot of testing locally in the area with friends and with gaming enthusiasts that go to game stores and whatnot, and cafes. So I'm reasonably confident about the balance, but with a card game, it's impossible to have it be perfectly balanced. It's kind of the fun of a card game is often that it's not completely balanced. So I'm also looking forward to embracing that. So maybe that answers your first part. Your second part, in terms of card design, I think we really look at it holistically. So I'm probably more guilty of this, where I have a card in mind, I have a character, an item, whatever, and I really want to express in the game. And I think of a really cool mechanic to wrap into this card, and it's really neat independently in a vacuum. And that's not good enough. You kind of have to look at it holistically, what it does to the whole set of cards you're releasing. And it might not fit into the other cards in that deck that you're kind of putting together for the player, or starting the player off with. So, we've gone through, I'm fairly sure we've gone through hundreds of different cards. I think the game is going to have about 100 unique player cards with roughly 2 copies each. So, we've gone through hundreds of cards at this point, through dozens of iterations of the whole game system, and there were some really cool cards in the mixer. I remember one was a flash mob, which is maybe an outdated reference at this point, but it was a flash mob in our kind of hackers faction, and I was in love with that card. It kind of did exactly what you'd think. It distracted. It was not totally controllable, but ultimately didn't fit into the whole set. So that's sort of a card that I have in the back of my mind that I'd like to put out eventually. Yeah, that's kind of how we approach card design, though.
Yeah. And speaking about doing stuff eventually or expanding on this game, I believe when we last spoke, we brought up the challenges of updating or adding in new content to a tabletop game. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but did we have a chat about Magic and how they cannot add in like a new Magic or a new monotype? I'm pretty sure it was with you, but it could have been with someone like that too.
I don't quite remember that, but my long-term memory is also not that good, so we may have.
Yeah. But keeping with that idea again of post-release support or adding on to this game, as you just said, Brian, one of the challenges of a tabletop game, or even just in any game in general, is understanding how your decisions or how your mechanics will act holistically with each other. Because you can have a really cool power, but if it completely breaks your entire game or completely, supersedes all your other content, then it's not going to work. And one of the challenges, as we've seen, not just in the tabletop side, but in digital games as well, is how do you keep adding layers to your game? As you said a few minutes ago, one of the things you're hoping with One Last Job is to grow this community and build this up for a lot of people to enjoy. And one of the major parts of that, as everyone is no doubt aware of, is post-release support. So, yes, what are your thoughts on when it comes to having to take this idea that you spend months or even years on and say, okay, Now what do we do with it from here?
For me, I think that's the part of design that I get most excited about is just thinking about expanding the game. I'm, I think any game is ultimately about constraining your design space. You could start off with a game that has unlimited design space and it's massive and it's not grounded as a result. So, I think we have some good constraints in the game. We have, like movement rules in the game, which, constrain what you can do and how fast you can do it. There's some basic systemic level balances in the game on that level. But in terms of what we can do with the card design is very, very big. I'm not at all worried about us being limited in any way or running out of ideas. So like I said, we have a document in Google right now, which is our kind of spreadsheet of all of our cards, and then we have another document that's all of the kind of discarded cards that we just don't work in the set for whatever reason. So there's a huge number of ideas there. And I'm also just, I don't know, I often just kind of have a random idea for some card and kind of file it in the back of my mind for later.
All right. Yep, and it's always interesting when I speak to developers about like that idea of post-release support and how for a lot of these games you always have those ideas that just don't necessarily fit with the base content, but they can be used as fuel for whatever you come up with so and so in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely agree with that.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Now, when it comes to, I guess, designing the rule set of the tabletop, one thing I've spoken to a few developers about, especially the importance of playtesting, and I want to kind of get your thoughts on that category. I guess for you, what kind, or have you done any playtesting with One Last Job or the last few months, and what are some, I guess, major elements that you look for if you did do it?
Sure. Yeah. I live in the Bay Area here, and in East Bay, which is Oakland, Berkeley, those cities around there, we have a very active group. It's also in San Francisco, but primarily focused on East Bay, called Bay Area Tabletop Developers. So it's called BAT Dev. On Facebook, you can find an open group, and if you're in the area and interested in play testing and having your game played, playing other games, I definitely recommend joining it. So that's my plug. But anyway, through that group, we've done. I've been a part of it for I think close to 2 years, and we've done a significant amount of play testing. It's mostly other tabletop developers in the area, people that are either hobbyists or people who are taking it very seriously and trying to get games published or taking games to Kickstarter. A few people from that group have successfully funded games on Kickstarter, and there's at least one or two people I know who are working with publishers right now. So different approaches people take. But within that group, we've had years of playtesting for the game. That's I think our primary source of playtesting, and what we primarily look for. I often just, I think I sometimes play the game with another person, sometimes have two new people play each other, sometimes have two people that have played the game a dozen times play it. In any case, I'm first looking for kind of surface level stuff. What's confusing about the rules? If people misplay a card, that's very common. They assume or they take a certain interpretation of a card that we didn't intend. So that's, we respond to that by either adjusting a little bit of text on the card sometimes. Sometimes the card has too much text. Sometimes the effect that we're going for just doesn't jive with their intuition of what the card should do. If you have a card that's like a getaway driver and it has nothing to do with movement, if it just buffs some stat, that might be unintuitive for a player. That's kind of a constructed example that doesn't actually fit anything. But anyway, that's maybe a point. So that's kind of the first thing we look for is just sort of confusion. With card games are pretty complicated, so you want to make sure that players at least vaguely understand how to play the game. From there, other things come out like balance. I think it's a relatively minor concern for us. Like we're mostly focused on the game being fun, the game delivering on the premise, so connecting to the theme of heist and working on that level. We're always looking for exciting moments in the game. Like if I want every game to. Every time you play the game, I hope there's one moment that's memorable. I think that's a good target. So we look for things like that. Balance, I think we more test on our own. We more talk through it. We play a couple games. I'm even in terms of playtesting, I like to even construct scenarios. So maybe you want to guarantee the player starts off with this card that you're worried about being too overpowered if it's in the opening hand. So we might just throw it in the opening hand and really force those scenarios to happen. So a lot of different approaches. I've tried to do testing online with Tabletop Simulator. I've done it, but it's a little bit too tedious for me. I think the physical manipulation of the cards works a lot better.
Mm-hmm. Now, one question that I didn't ask, I want to bring up before I forget, Brian. In terms of, I guess, the skill level or the complexity of One Last Job, is this aimed at, expert tabletop players, core, casual, or, a fair mix of everybody?
Yeah, I guess I don't really have the language to know what demographic. I'd say it's for people that play tabletop games. If you don't play tabletop games at all, and well, I'd say if you play computer games, you could still jump into it. But if you're not a gamer at all, this is not the best entry into the hobby. But I think it's a good entry into the card game hobby. So people that are not traditionally card gamers, but they play board games or they play computer games, I think this is a good entry point. The rule set is, I think we trimmed it down as much as we can while still bringing out the experience we want players to have. So that was really our, the two balances between just going crazy with the rules and crazy with the theme and the excitement and all those other emotions, and the simplicity of the game. I'm really happy where we ended up in terms of those two balances.
Mm-hmm. And it's always challenging when you're trying to design a game from scratch like that, in terms of your audience. Because as we've seen, I'm sure you're no doubt aware, especially from tabletop and traditional game design, it's always hard to know just exactly who your game is being aimed for. Because you can think your game is, the easiest thing in the world, and then you put it out to people, and they're like, what the hell is this thing? I have no idea what I'm looking at.
Yeah, with any game, I think you could have a very simple game that people can't figure out and can't learn, or a very complicated game that people jump right into. I think it's more about that the person that is playing your game sees the promise immediately. That in the first couple turns, they see where things are leading, and it's exciting them, and they're looking at the cards in their hand, they're connecting it to the cards on the table, and all the gears are spinning in the right direction. So that's more where my focus is just making sure that as you start to learn the game, as you start to play it, it's exciting to you, and it's something that you want to invest the time into to truly learn it. So yeah, I don't know if that's maybe an answer to that question.
All right. I think with that, we spoke about a lot about One Last Job. I'm sure we'll come back to it later on in today's stream. But I also want to get to the other major topic, and that's talking more about creating the art for the game. And then we'll probably talk a little bit about your plans for the Kickstarter, or things that you've done research on, things you've planned, as a way for developers watching this who may have thoughts on their own, and kind of a way to kind of learn by watching what someone else is doing. But let's move on for now, and let's talk about art, because this is a very interesting topic. As we talked about on email, your background has been in programming and game design, and not traditionally in art. And for me,
Correct.
My background has nothing to do with art because I can't draw or paint or anything to save my life. But as we both know, and I'm sure for anyone watching knows, art is a very important part of the visual aspects, can make or break a game. Not only in terms of a design standpoint, it's being able to understand what you're looking at, but also in terms of presentation and advertising. Because if your game, like we talked about this before, but if you're trying to sell a game on Steam or even on Kickstarter and you have no art whatsoever, no actual footage of your game, yeah, it's not going to do so hot. So, I guess to start with for you, Brian, what has kind of been like the process for you in terms of transitioning from just doing programming and design to start thinking about your game from an artistic point of view?
It's been interesting. Yeah, I think you summarized. So I'm not an artist in really any way beyond maybe just paint and a little bit of Photoshop. But actually constructing artwork is not something I've ever really done seriously. So yeah, our game One Last Job has some pretty detailed illustrations, and I've kind of acted as the art director, which is in any sort of traditional game, the person who comes up with the the overall style of the game, and works with individual artists to make sure that style comes to life. Make sure that that overall vision is maybe the better word, comes to life. So I'm kind of trying to serve that role, and primarily what that looks like for One Last Job is thinking about a character. We have a hacker character, for example. So trying to figure out where is she? What does she look like? What is she doing? Those basic questions. And then writing that down so that the artist I'm sending to has something to work from. And that also involves giving them images to help guide them. So maybe here's a reference pose. Here's the pose I want this character to be in. And I might find that on the internet, just looking at people sitting down on Google, or I've even taken photos of myself and my girlfriend, whoever's around, in those reference poses I want to, so that the camera angle and the pose of the character are right where we want them. And then it's also kind of just making this world come alive. So I'm very interested in world building. You know, I read George R. R. Martin books, the Game of Thrones books, and he's a fantastic world builder. And so I don't have any ideas that I'll achieve something like that, but I do like to try and make the art pieces fit together, where you might notice a little detail in one piece that connects up to another piece, and making the world really come alive through those details. So trying to be detail oriented while not actually drawing it myself. So trying to, yeah, and there's always miscommunication, and you know, the artist might not follow your instructions exactly, and kind of adapting to that on the fly. So all of that stuff I'm just learning now, and making it up as I go along.
And having that sense of world building or lore building is such an underrated aspect, I think, for a lot of video games, because it really can do a lot, not only to bring the player into the world, but can also help when it comes to the design and growing your game, because you can use that kind of as, you know, the story bible or the template for what you're going to do going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm very interested in this world we're building. It has a lot of characters that, so like we have one of the factions is the street gangs, and they're probably my favorite right now because they're all these wild characters. We have two different street gangs within that faction, and one of them they view themselves as cowboys, so they kind of will ride horses into banks and lasso people. And this is in a modern setting, and any sort of misplaced time like that, any sort of anachronism, I'm always interested in. And so then there's like the hacker faction, and you know, I'm a programmer, so I try and insert as much geeky jokes into that as I can. There's a faction that's all about being a secret society, so you know, I've very interested in things like oh geez, I'm trying to remember the name of that show right now. That's completely anyway, very interesting connection to different pop culture that I'm interested in, and yeah, you know, it's just we also have like inside jokes in there where you know, I drink a type of tea called yerba mate, which is a South American highly caffeinated tea because I don't do coffee. So we have a lot of jokes in there about yerba mate, which has sort of become inside joke with a group of friends I have. So little details like that I'm interested in putting into the game.
Cool. As a quick aside, quick question from Mike in chat. He was just wondering regarding the PC version, if your Kickstarter doesn't work, would you still plan on doing that if the Kickstarter doesn't succeed as planned?
Sorry for the sirens here. I'm throwing up some art on the screen, which might help people visualize better. Yeah, so you know, I'd say the whole point of the Kickstarter is to figure out if this game is something that, you know, I traditionally view myself as more of an artistic person, even though I'm a programmer, not artistic in the visual sense, but I think of myself as like making games for the art of making games, and not thinking about the market and all this kind of stuff. And lately, I'd say over the past couple of years, I've really started to shift and trying to think about, yeah, I do want to make games for these reasons that are not purely financial, but at the same time, I need to figure out how to make this financially stable so that I can actually do it. So the Kickstarter was really trying to figure that out. It was making a computer game, digital card game, is a big investment of time and money, and the goal was to make it physical first because that would be less time and less money. I don't know if that's actually true in hindsight, but that was the idea. So I think if this just totally fell flat, I'm really hoping it doesn't. But if it did, I don't think I'd be pursuing the digital version because it just wouldn't fit into the, while I want to make the game and want to make it into something, it needs to be able to support itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that may have answered your second question there too, Mike, about starting with physical. But getting back to the topic of art, and again with this concept of lore building or world building, a major part of that is deciding on the overall tone or the aesthetics of your game. Mm. And to give you some really good examples of this, I can talk about the stuff from Clay Entertainment with titles like Don't Starve, Invisible Ink, and I just recently, or for those of you watching this live, I just recently picked up Pyre from Supergiant Games. They are, of course, the makers of Bastion and Transistor, which are three amazing examples of how much an overall aesthetic point of view or the overall aesthetics of a game can add to that title. Now, of course, you're building a tabletop game, so you're not thinking about things on that grand sense of a scale. But in terms of like the aesthetics or that tone, how did you decide what you wanted for One Last Job?
So, yeah, can your viewers see the art on the screen right now? I'm not sure if that's coming through.
Let me see.
It should be in place of my camera right now. So it's one piece, one example.
Yes, they should be able to see it. Yeah.
Okay, so this kind of gives you a visual of what we're aiming for. So this piece is actually maybe a little more detailed than, the game's going to feature quite a few different artists, and they'll each have their slight different take on it. Where is my more art? So I can bring up another example. What's a good example? This one maybe. So this is a different artist. So it's a slightly different piece, slightly different style. The line works a little bit different and whatnot. So the game will have a little bit different style to it, just because we have different artists. But I think overall, I'm a big fan of comics. I shouldn't say a big fan, but I'm a fan of comics, and I think of like comics from the 90s. The one that comes to mind immediately is Watchmen. So there's kind of an overall look there where I want the game to be grounded. I want it to look like the real world, but these are comic characters. They're not overly realistic, so there's some the line work might not always be exact, things like that. Beyond that, I like color. I want there to be a lot of colors in the game, so we really tried to, like, her hair here is this kind of blue, and then there's this yellow behind her. So those highlights on the card, I think, will really help people identify the card. So if you have, maybe 8-10 different cards on the table, you can still identify each very quickly just from those colors and where they are on the card, if you're not focusing on the artwork too much. So those are all important aspects to the overall look. I feel like there was one other thing I was going to mention, but I'm not remembering right now.
Oh, maybe this will help you. When it comes to, again, the sense of world building or lore building, when it comes to the overall aesthetics of the game, I guess one thing that I see that I think can somewhat be distracting is if a game tries to make use of multiple kinds of aesthetics in a single title, or if you're reading like a graphic novel or a book and it goes from maybe like a super detailed look to then something very cartoony and then back and forth. Like, I do think it's very important that once you settle on that style, to really stick to it, like have that be the foundation for the rest of your game.
Sure, and a lot of this comes, we just had a new artist join, not join, but contribute. She's working on a new piece now, and so I kind of had to describe to her what we're aiming for, what we're looking at, and a lot of that was just sending her our existing pieces of art and describing the overall feel of the game. Like it could be the type of game that is very stylistic, where the characters are, don't quite look human, but they're that's one way to take it. Or it can be ultra realistic, where it's like detailed line work. And so describing where we are in that spectrum is something I focus on when bringing a new artist into the mix and try and communicate that effectively. I think it's mostly worked so far. We've only worked with three or I guess four artists now, so we haven't taken in a lot of new people. But overall, I've been happy with what they've done.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and as an interesting tangent, one of the things I found, at least for myself in the last few years, has been really enjoying when developers go for the stylistic approach versus, as you said, the hyper-realism. Because I think it helps it stand the test of time better. I've been talking to, or here on the Game Wisdom YouTube channel, I have what we call the Saturday Night Grab Bag, where I have fans vote on what games in my backlog to play. And a lot of the games they've picked are those that are like 5, 10 years plus old. And one of the things that the games that really do hold up well, you can really tell by their graphics. Like, obviously they're not using the latest engines or the latest techniques, but just from a stylistic or thematic point of view, they still look as good as they were, in 2005, 2004,
Oh yeah,
as they do today.
Think about a game like Spelunky. That game's never going to look bad. It's not the most high fidelity game ever, but it looks great, and it's always going to look that good. But compared to something like, I think a good example is GoldenEye. I probably 5 years ago went back and played GoldenEye on an N64 and was just shocked at how frankly, how bad it looked to my modern. But when I was a kid playing that game, it was the best looking thing. That it played wonderful. It was amazing at the time. But now, compared to modern aesthetics, it's quite bad. Most of it is just a low resolution, especially on the 4-player split screen. But yeah, I think that's true. Is you want your game, no matter what stylistic choices you make, to kind of like stand the test of time. Another important constraint for us was just cost. As a card game, we have a huge number of, we want not quite every card, but most cards, all of the player cards, we want to have unique art. It's very important for us, if we're making a card game, that we have unique art on each of the cards. It's a very important thing for how it helps your players connect to that game world, and how it helps players play the game by identifying cards, all of those things. And so we needed to find a style that we could realistically produce.
Yeah.
And that means we don't have a huge budget for each piece of art, and we are trying to find really good artists, but make it so that they can produce the pieces within our budget. All of those kind of real world constraints.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up, Brian, because that's another major part of this, and just a major part of game design as a whole, is being able to settle on these hard decisions for your game as early in the development process as possible. Because as you said, you can't exactly at this point say, you know what, we're going to completely change our overall look for One Last Shot now. And being able to make those tough choices can be very troubling, especially for any new or first-time developers watching. So I guess for you, Brian, what was that point where the aesthetics clicked, in the sense that you said, this is what I want our game to look like, this is it, the foot's down, the line is drawn kind of moment?
Sure. I guess I'm thinking back, and I think it was this piece that's on the screen right now. This is Chemburn. It's kind of one of our main hacker characters. And this is one of the first pieces I commissioned, at least one of the first characters I commissioned. And so I spent a good amount of time just thinking about this character and finding references and trying to make sure it fit whatever sort of vision I had in my head, which was rough at best. And I sent this to one of our artists, and this artist in particular is quite fast. So they came back pretty quick with just, let's see if I could bring it up. I have... the sketches. So this was the first sketch of that character. So this is just the line work and the shading and no color. So they sent this back, and it immediately worked for me. It was exactly the type of... There was some small differences. So here's a second edition. The first version of this, I realized that there was something missing, and I wanted it to be a little more dynamic, so I added this cat. I also her face expression, I wanted her to be much more focused on what she was doing. So the cat was added to highlight that she's very focused on her computer, and her eyebrows were changed to match that as well. Then there's just some small details, like I added some more wires in the top right because I felt that corner was a little bit empty. You'll even see on the coffee cup, it switches from coffee to a yerba mate gourd, which is how you drink yerba mate. So that's one of the yerba mate references there. Small details. There was one of the books was missing a title. A lot of these book titles I filled in. A lot of them the artist just improvised, and there's some they don't, I don't know where they are with English. Some of the titles are really funny on sort of that level. Yeah, so I guess this piece here, why I mentioned it, is developing this piece, going through all those steps, gave me confidence that we could hit the style we were going for, and the artist executed on our vision. And this piece right here has really guided us moving forward to make sure that holistically all the pieces are coming together and fitting. So that's kind of where we are.
All right. Quick question from chat. Are you going to be using an engine or in-house tech for designing One Last Job? I'm not sure if you're at that point yet.
So early on, I'd say within the first 3 months of developing One Last Job, me and Adam were both programmers. He's more of a back-end kind of server-side web developer, and I traditionally am more of a client, like focused on the game itself. I don't do web development too much. So we started, we kind of would get overwhelmed with design work, and we would take these breaks where we just spend a few days programming, just meet up at some cafe and do some programming. So we do have that tech sitting around. The server side stuff is all in Google Cloud. I forget what it's called. The app, Google Apps Engine, and then client side is all in Unity. So I'm the type of programmer. I've been doing it long enough where I am not loyal to any sort of technology or engine. It's all pragmatic. It's just what is going to serve us best for this project. So I would make that decision on a project by project basis. I would even start with Unity and maybe switch to something else as needed. It's really just very dependent on what the project needs. I think if I was to do it right now, if I was just to start right now and this is what we're doing, we have the funding, whatever, I would probably just use Unity, because I do contract work right now, and I work in Unity quite a bit, and I'm very comfortable with that engine. In the past, I've just made my own engine, sort of. I don't know if you'd call it an engine, but I just cobbled together different open source programming libraries and made the game. That's something I would consider for a project that required that. Yeah, I don't know. That somewhat answers that question, I guess. It's a big question.
All right. Now, getting back to the topic of art, one thing that you touched on a few minutes ago that I want to bring up is how the aesthetics either help define or accentuate the gameplay, or what someone's looking at while they're playing. Now, for traditional digital games, we can talk about how the UI or the aesthetics can help, I guess, help the player understand what's going on. Be it, say, all red projectiles in a game are bad, or if I see the color green, that means it's a healing. Those are, basic affordances.
Right.
Now, you said, like, with the card, with your hacker card, you wanted to have, like, that specific yellow hue there to kind of help to show that it's maybe part of, like, the hacker style or stuff like that. So I guess continuing along that point, how does your aesthetic and your color is either helping to influence the game design, or basically helping someone understand what's going on in the game?
So yeah, certainly artwork's a big part of that, and we have different types of cards. So we have cards that represent people, so those would be our actors or operatives, and we have items. So I mean that's pretty easy to demonstrate. You see a person on the screen now, and then this is it's kind of an item. We have like an item here, so that's just one thing. It's like the artwork can be very literal in how you're depicting these objects, and how you're another thing is just the card layouts. So
yeah.
I don't know. Here's a magic card here. This is a set where they were trying some unique things with the layout. So this doesn't look like most magic cards. But we spent a lot of time just looking at this and ignoring the art. This is a dinosaur, I guess. But we kind of look at these other things, what they're doing with the borders and all of that. So that's another thing we're working on right now, is just what do our card layouts look like? So there's I don't know, there's a ton of different iterations here of our operatives as we're working through. So I could kind of go through these, and you see slight variations as I'm moving forward through them. So what we're doing here is we're figuring out how do we make it so that this operative here, which is indicated in this spot right here on the card. I'm not sure if my cursor shows up, but you can kind of see, underneath the name it says operative. So we're trying to make it sure that all of the operative cards share some properties. So all of the operative cards in this example would kind of, they'd have this blue frame on the edges. They would have, I think we have better examples. Like this is what we're going right now. So all the operatives are going to have this kind of folder thing at the top right.
Yeah.
So that's something that only the operative cards will have, this folder. And, they have these boxes here on the left side, which is kind of a skill property that only operatives have. So if you're looking through a hand of 5 cards, you could pretty quickly see, oh, I have 2 operatives here, because you'll notice that only the operatives have this. And this is nothing that's explained to the player, just something that as you're looking at all your cards, you'll notice these patterns. And at the same time, you might have, so this purple color right here that you see on the borders, that represents the faction. So this might be the hacker faction will have maybe this purple theme to it. They might end up with something like a green theme for obvious reasons, but just in this example. So, you'll kind of be able to identify, all the little purple bits, that indicates that it belongs to this faction within the crew. And that'll help you read the cards in that way too. So there's a lot of categorization. So a lot of that I think is on these borders and on the card layout, more so than the artwork. Although there's some obvious things with the artwork, like Chemburn here, there's a lot of neon. These kind of like neon looks will show up a lot on the hacker cards, and that stuff won't show up at all on the cowboy cards because it just obviously shouldn't. They'll have a lot of browns and a lot of
no
Wild
chrome
West
cowboys then, I guess.
Not in this set. Maybe eventually, but no, I don't think so.
Yeah, and a lot of very interesting discussions to unpack there, Brian. I mean, again, we could probably talk about UI and that kind of, making things easy to understand for like next hour or so easily. But like Oscar was talking about in chat, like having different color coding for the card types. As you said, having like specific border colors to represent different factions and stuff like that. All these little affordances, like again, like for someone watching this who may not know about card design or game design, this all seems like very, non-important or ancillary discussions. Who cares about the color of a border, or who cares what font you're using? But as we all know, these little touches can go a very long way in terms of making it easy to process. As you just said a second ago, Brian, like the dream is that someone looks at 5-6 cards in their hand, and just by looking at the overall appearance or design of that card, they know within milliseconds, okay, this is a operator card, this is an item card, this is for this faction, this is for that. And getting it to that point where someone can do that takes a lot of work and obviously a lot of iterating.
Absolutely. We kind of view it as, and this is not just us, other people have this idea too of you have sort of a budget in your game for complexity. Every game has a complexity budget. It changes because like some it depends on your audience, right? But the audience, we have a certain budget for complexity. It's nothing we have written down. We kind of just know it. And we don't want to spend any of that complexity budget on the card layouts. We want that to be as simple and straightforward. And, we don't want people to be having to spend a lot of time processing these layouts and figuring out what type of card is this, because that eats into your complexity budget. You want to put that into the game. You want to put that into what makes the game interesting to play. So it's absolutely vital for you to really think through these details.
Mm-hmm. I like that term, complexity budget, as well. I think that's a really good way of describing this, because as you just said, depending upon your player base, I mean, I know people who've played games like Dwarf Fortress or Crusader Kings, immensely complicated games, and they are fine with those layers. But then you show to a new player, and that stuff will bounce them off of that title faster than you can say install. And there's, oh man, this is like its own little discussion right here, but the differences between simplifying a game versus streamlining it. And I think that's another major point. You don't want your game to be, so simple that everyone figures it out, but you still need things to be streamlined enough, because as you said, someone can look at this card and they don't need to, consult a rule book or go to an online guide to figure out what they're looking at.
I think I got that term from my friend John Trevironis. He designs a game called Duelist, which is a digital card game.
Oh, yeah.
And I met him. I play Netrunner with him, and yeah, fantastic player, fantastic designer. But he kind of, I think, just talking to him about these, he's really helped us with One Last Job, just play testing and giving suggestions, ideas, and I think he introduced that idea to me, maybe. But yeah.
I would love to talk to him as well, because I played a little bit of Duelist earlier this year, and it is very fascinating. That is like, I'm just make sure we're talking about the same game. That's the online game, sort of like you control your cards like they're units on a field, and you're moving them around. Oh yeah. Yeah, I would love to talk to him if you can introduce us.
Remind me after this, but I'll try and connect you two up.
Yeah, but yeah, that's a really good term again, and as we said, it's very tricky to find that balance, because there are some people who feel like complexity is like, like the medal, the badge of honor you wear when it comes to playing a video game, but you have to understand just where you want the player to be thinking about that stuff. Like, to give you an example, I've talked about this before when it comes to UI design. The player should not have to guess at what they're looking at on screen. That should be the easiest part of your game to understand.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think Factorio is a good example. That game is very deep and very complicated, and I don't think that game needs to be simplified. It's serving the audience that wants a game like that, and it certainly has become streamlined, I think, as you put it, where they found little ways to improve the UI. They spent a lot of time just adjusting artwork to fit intuition better. It's making it fit intuition, but that game is serving the audience quite well, and it would not serve them better to simplify it, but it does help to streamline things when appropriate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I guess another big question that I have for you, like, is you brought up the Magic example earlier. I guess, are there any other things that you took from Magic, either as a pro or a con, when it comes to your card design?
It's a good question. I'm not a huge Magic player myself. I've certainly played the game, but I've not really gotten too invested in it in one way or another. Just mostly because I spend so much time playing Netrunner, and it's hard to support two hobbies like that while also being a busy person and all that. But anyway, so I think we often. My design partner Adam, I think, is a little bit more in tune with Magic, and so when we're discussing. When we were discussing design considerations for the game, we would very often come back to Magic. And, there's a reason why it's such a popular game. Part of that is a collectability. Part of that is just it has such a rich history, and they've really brought out so many interesting mechanics and dynamics within that game. So I'm trying to give you an example right now. It's hard to come up with something on the fly, but we've certainly just like what makes the economy work in Magic, things on that level. What is good about it? Our economy is very different from Magic, which has these mana cards, these lands that you get to use every turn, and it like progressively builds over time. And what does that do for you in terms of like there's a very clear ability for a certain card to be a late game card versus an early game card, and our game doesn't have that as much. So we've been able to really compare and contrast using a game like Magic, or a game like Ashes is another fascinating example of an economy, because it's very different from Magic. They use dice for that game, but it's also kind of mana, and our game's a little bit closer to that. So that's maybe just on an economic level how we can compare and contrast and figure out what advantages does Magic give you, and the disadvantages that you could get you get a handful of late game stuff and you can't do anything with that. That can be frustrating, but that also provides some opportunities in deck building, and so it's a big question to get into and hard to come up with specific examples.
All right, I'll get to your question in a second, Oscar, in chat. But one other thing I just want to bring up regarding, as you said, the difference between like a game like Magic and a game like One Last Job. I think another major part about this is when it comes to this idea of rarity. Like, obviously, with a game like Magic, you have the commercial aspect of, buying different booster sets and getting those rare cards. But in a game like One Last Job, or with most traditional tabletop games, the player is given all the cards at the start. It's not like someone's going to have to buy five or
Right.
six different box copies and make sure they get that one, limited edition foil version.
Yeah, I think I've always been drawn to the non-collectible games. Maybe it's just kind of getting a little bit older and not wanting to invest that time to find all the pieces to make a deck. But it's always appealed to me. So we decided to choose that format as well. It's also just, I think, a lot simpler to
Oh,
not have to create a randomized game. Again, going back to my buddy John, who works on Duelist, that is a randomized, has booster packs and all that. And it adds such a huge layer of complexity
yes.
to just the design of the game, and how you make sure that a rare card is fair and balanced, but also exciting to play with, exciting to collect, and balancing that with kind of monetization stuff. It's all very complicated and not something we wanted to get into for our first game like this.
I think that was definitely a wise decision there, Brian. And I mean, right there, that's a good hour and a half, I think, discussion with someone about that kind of rarity mixed with the balance of your game.
Mm.
Now, question from Oscar in chat. Are there any other card games that influence your design? What parts and why it could work on your game, if any? That was his question.
Yeah, so we played a lot of the, other than obviously Netrunner, which we kind of play for fun and competitively. We tried a lot of other card games. So some that come to mind, there's a lot of similar card games that Fantasy Flight Games produces. There was Conquest, which is not around anymore, but we played that one quite a bit. The Game of Thrones card game. A lot of these card games are more similar to Magic than any other card game. They're kind of that same basic genre of putting down people or creatures and having them fight each other to gain victory in some way. They all have their own twist on it, but they all kind of fit into that. I guess if you were to, like, we have first person shooters. I think that there's the Magic genre of card games that is not named, which is like, I don't know, creature battlers or whatever. Maybe there's a name. But so pretty much all the card games we've played feature that dynamic. Ashes is another one that comes to mind that I mentioned briefly, which is fascinating. I can't play that game because it's way too computationally complex. It's like playing chess. It's but a fascinating game. One that surprised me, just that we were just playing games, picking up whatever we could just to get inspiration and deal with design dilemmas. A friend of mine at the card game store kind of just egged me on to buy the My Little Pony card game. Which, at the time I didn't know much about. I'd heard was like a reasonable game, but I kind of was like, what, it's $20, I'll buy the starter set, whatever. And Adam and I played through that a few times, and I was quite surprised. It's a reasonable game. It totally works. It feels balanced. It's like, it's interesting to play. I don't think it didn't blow me away or anything, and I was surprised that we kind of share a lot of similarities in terms of some of the economy is actually pretty similar. The game plays out very differently ultimately, but there's some surprising connections to One Last Job that I wasn't expecting, and we were able to learn from that game, which is always, that's what you hope for if you're designing a game and playing games in that context, is you want to learn something from a game. So those are some examples of card games.
Mm-hmm. Mike asks in chat, what books do you have on your bookshelf? They're very impressive from where he's sitting.
Oh, the ones behind me? I have a bunch of programming books right now. Let's see. I have the Effective C++ series, Effective C++, and More Effective C++. If you're a C++ developer, you should have those books and read them. They're wonderful. I have a couple Lua programming guides because I'm a big fan of the Lua scripting language. There's a fair number of gender theory books because my partner, my girlfriend, is a woman studies major, so she has a bunch of books like that. And then I have some just some novels and whatnot, cookbooks, a lot of cookbooks too, and some DVDs I don't watch anymore. But anyway, that's what I've got on my bookshelf.
All right. Now, one part I want to talk about in terms of the aesthetics of designing One Last Child that we haven't spoke about is the actual physical construction of these cards. As we've said, One Last Job is going to be a physical game first. And one thing that I've spoken to several designers, I think I've spoken to several tabletop and card game designers in the past about, is trying to figure out the logistics when it comes to designing your card. You know, how big do you want the card? What kind of paper do you use? What's going to actually be like the overall like dimensions of your box, stuff like that. Have you started to think about that stuff, or have you already thought about in terms of what is your game going to look like when it's, you know, in the person's hands?
Right. Yeah. So we've done a fair bit of research into that, and we're getting very close to the point where we're going to just lock in a contract with a manufacturer for all the details. But we have it pretty well planned out. So the cards themselves are going to be pretty standard. We're very much following Magic, and a lot of card games conform to Magic standards for obvious reasons. You want people to be able to buy sleeves for their cards and they're compatible, things like that. So that's the kind of 3.5 by 2.5 inch card format is what we're fitting into. And I'm trying to remember the details. There's all these fascinating differences in the card stock, but I think we're going to have the pretty standard card stock that Magic uses. We might go for a slight upgrade. There's kind of different in terms of the. So here's how they make cards. They print it on a big sheet, and I think there's usually 2 or 3 layers within that sheet. So they have like a middle layer, which is to prevent light from leaking through, so you can't actually see through the card and pick out the art, and you know that would be a problem if you're against the other side of the table. You can just see your opponent's cards. So they have different kind of I forget what they call them, the layer inside. They call it like black core or ivory core. So we might upgrade that just so that we're sure that no light is going to leak through. But that's kind of the cards. We have some tokens in the game. Those are going to be the pretty standard cardboard tokens that you see in a lot of board games. So again, based on Kickstarter stretch goals, we might upgrade a lot of these components, but the basic will be that. What else? So the box and all the components, I've kind of used Google SketchUp. It's a kind of a very simple AutoCAD modeling program I've used in the past for various things. So I used that. I sketched up you can go to sub-millimeter scale on this, so it's very accurate. So I've kind of laid everything out, did the dimensions to make sure things will fit into the box, all of that kind of stuff. The box itself is, I'm trying to think of another game. I don't know. It's going to be smaller than like a Ticket to Ride board game, about half that size. I don't know. That's some details, but I don't know how interesting that stuff is. But yeah, we've kind of had to work through those kind of details.
All right. As a quick time check, I know we've gone over an hour at this point in terms of the streaming. I know you have to get going in an hour yourself. So I figure we'll spend maybe like another 20 to 30 minutes chatting, and then we'll probably start to wrap things up. For those of you watching this live right now, if you have any final questions regarding the aesthetics or packaging of One Last Job, feel free to get them in now because we'll be moving on in probably the next 2 to 3 minutes. But one question that I wanted to bring up to you, Brian, regarding, again, the aesthetics of the game or designing this physical game. Again, going back to the fact that this is your first full-time or your first full physical game, I want to ask you, for any developers watching this either live or recorded, do you have any, useful tips or guidelines, kind of lessons learned when it comes to building this physical game that, you may not have thought about when you were first designing it, but you're kind of had to figure this out as you've gone, kind of thing?
Sure. One thing that immediately comes to mind is I spent a good amount of time on this game full time, and I would not recommend doing that just because it's a tabletop market in particular is basically very few people are actually making money off of it, making it be a job. There's a lot of people that are doing it as a hobby, and I think it's, in hindsight, I've since switched to part-time. I do this part-time now, and I kind of fill out my time with some contract work and some volunteer work and things like that. But I would definitely recommend, if you're interested in this type of stuff, jump into it. Find people in the area that can help you play test, whether they're friends of yours that you can invite over every couple of weeks and give them pizza. playtesting, I think, is the hardest part for me. It's like this thing where you're asking someone to give you some of their time to play something that probably isn't very good. So I'm lucky in that the city I live in, there's a very active community. You know, I can play test once a week, twice a week in some cases, and there's gonna be 10 people at the game store, the cafe that, you know, will all play each other's games. On that level, if you do find such a group, I would recommend the first time you join them, even the first couple times, don't bring your game. Go there just to play other people's games, to meet people. It is a community effort when you have a developer group like that. So there's a lot of people that have spent a lot of time playing other people's games, and it's important that those people have time to get their games played too. So I think it's important to kind of contribute time. Those are some brief things that come to mind. I'd say if you want to do it, just do it. With tabletop games, there's the barrier to entry is so small. Like at the basic level, you just get index cards and write up some rules. You know, that's how we started. I bought a big thing of blank playing cards on Amazon, and we just started writing on them. And it's really a fantastic hobby in that way for you to just get in there and start making stuff. Except that things are going to probably not go so smoothly at the start. You know, again, I think playtesting is the hardest thing. Iteration is the hardest thing. Just staying motivated, all of this kind of stuff.
All right. And 2 questions from Oscar and Chad, and then I think we'll move on. The first one is, for the manufacturing of the game materials, is it being done by a central company, or does the company have like several factories, and I guess the game is sent to those?
So there's there's a few ways to do this. Most games are produced in China because it is significantly cheaper to do so. I wish that wasn't the case, but it kind of is. So what we're probably going to go with is there's this company called Panda Manufacturer, I guess. And I've spoken to them, and they're very helpful. They're kind of a middleman, I'd say. So they will take all your specifications, and they'll work with a factory or multiple factories if needed to produce the game. And you know, you also need to handle distribution and shipping those games out, all that. But Panda is something that I've gotten a lot of confidence from just speaking with one of their people over there. But there's other ways you can do it. You can work directly with manufacturers. There's factories you could call that specialize in board games, and that's a way to actually produce a game slightly cheaper. But you know, there's upsides and downsides to all of that. So there's a lot of different ways to do it, but generally most people, as I understand it, are either working with a factory directly in China or working with there's a couple companies like this that kind of serve as a middleman between you and the factory. So upsides and downsides to all of it.
All right. And I guess that is a good lead into the second part of his question. How do you choose like the manufacturer for your game? Are there any common or best ones regarding like this type of manufacturing? Be it, you know, a well-respected one that does card games, well-respected one that may just do figurines, and so on.
So we haven't fully decided yet. I'm 90% of the way there, and I'm pretty confident we know where we're going to go with it. But so I did submit to a good number. I submitted to probably, I think, 4 different manufacturers, and they each have a process to get a quote. So that's the first thing you do is you need to know the basics of what your game, like what's going to be in the box, the components. So they have usually a form you fill out or whatever, a person you email to give them those specifications, and they will need a lot of detail because they're giving you a quote that's going to be locked in for some period of time. So all that stuff needs to be set up. So I got back a few of these quotes, and they give you the price layout. The way they do it is it's going to be like, here's the minimum number of units, which for most manufacturers is going to be either 1,000 or 1,500. Okay. So that's the number of copies of games you need to produce for them to do it at all. They're not going to produce 2 copies for you.
Oh, yeah.
Although the Game Crafter is a site I can definitely suggest for that level. It's based in, I think, Wisconsin. If you want to just produce 1 or 2 copies to play with your friends or to send out, Game Crafter is a great way to do that. They're way more expensive, but for just a single copy, whatever, it's great. So yeah, they sent back these quotes where they had, here's if you do 1,000, here's if you do 5,000, 10,000, etc. And you could see the price go down as you scale up. Oh, yes. So all of that kind of informs your decision. And you might see, this company is cheaper on the card stock, but they're more expensive on the tokens, whatever. And you just sort of do math and figure out which one you're going with. And there's other things that factor in, like you try and figure out how reliable they are, try and find, I don't know if I went this far. I think I talked to one or two other board game developers and get their feedback on certain manufacturers. So I was recommended one or two manufacturers from another person who's successfully funded a few Kickstarter board games.
All right, cool. So I think with that, let's move on to talk about Kickstarter, and then if we have time, we'll talk a little briefly about your experience with game jams and things to recommend on that front. But
sure.
When it comes to Kickstarter, obviously, as we've said, One Last Job isn't at the Kickstarter phase just yet. Do you have a timetable or something you're shooting for to go onto Kickstarter?
Without any promises and all that, I'm aiming for January. I'm really pushing myself right now to get everything put together in time for January. So there's definitely a few more steps that need to hit before then, and a lot of work to do here in December, but that's the goal.
All right. Now, in terms of the Kickstarter, obviously you've been thinking about it for some time. And one of the more important parts when it comes to creating Kickstarter is when to start thinking about it. So I guess at what point during One Last Job's development did you start to, I guess, put some work to think about what you're doing with the Kickstarter?
Sure. So I think we came to this realization that we shouldn't produce the computer game version of One Last Job yet. We should, sort of test the market, see if there's any sort of demand for this type of game. And that's when we decided we kind of decided between Kickstarter or Indiegogo. We had reasons to consider both of them, but ultimately decided to go with Kickstarter. Anyway, from there it was kind of, we knew this is our first Kickstarter project, our first tabletop game, so we didn't want to make things too complicated. There's a lot of successful campaigns that have a huge number of stretch goals and tie into other books people are writing, whatever. They get very big and complicated, and I think Rising Sun was a great example of that. Just exploded out into all these little expansions and whatnot. But we knew we wanted to keep it relatively simple for our first one, try and make it so this can fund. And so that really informed our decision to have just a kind of single box. We're not going to do very many reward levels. Our reward levels are going to be pretty simple. We're not going to have to ship out multiple boxes to different people. All of that just makes it a lot more complicated. And, I think for a first campaign, we wanted to avoid all of that.
Yeah. And I guess it kind of takes me to my next question. So this is your first, I guess, actual Kickstarter project you're working on, Brian?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And
that I'm doing directly myself, at least.
Yeah. And it's very, hell, we could spend, again, every one of these topics we're bringing up, we could probably spend an hour. And yes, that was my fire alarm going off downstairs because I have family cooking right now. So we had Brian, the police siren in your background. I have the fire alarm. So maybe we'll get them both going off at the same time.
I'm not hearing it on your end.
You got lucky there, at least on that front. But back to Kickstarter. I guess in terms of like the overall project or the scope of the Kickstarter, what decisions have you made in terms of, what am I going to offer? What are our stretch goals? Or even just simply in terms of what it's going to look like?
Sure. So yeah, we've kind of looked at other Kickstarter. I have a list of other Kickstarters that have popped out at me for various reasons. Trying to find card games that are kind of similar in scope to ours. So that's really informed. There's kind of a pretty standard format to what a Kickstarter page should look like and should include at this point. So we're not going to deviate from that too much. We're going to have a video at the start. I'm quite happy with how the video is going to turn out. It's going to be a hybrid kind of me as a talking head at the end, but the start's going to kind of be this sort of quasi-narrative thing, quasi-gameplay thing, where we're kind of telling a basic narrative, but we're using cards to show that narrative and kind of giving you a basic idea of what the game feels like to play. So put a lot of time into storyboarding that video. I have to find an editor to actually produce it. And been a lot of pipelining, like figuring out, well, I need the artwork before I can hire the video editor because I need the artwork to put the video together, and I need a script, I need voiceover, so recording the voiceover. There's just been a lot of dependencies to figure out and to try and organize. So I've had a friend of mine named Velgus. He's been helping out on kind of a production level of helping us line up all of that, all these requirements, and he's helped quite a bit. So I've appreciated that.
Okay. Now here's, I guess this could be a tough question for you. What has been, I guess, the most challenging or the most like unassuming part of getting the Kickstarter campaign developed that kind of surprised you, like it being your first Kickstarter project?
I mean, everyone kind of told me that it's a very time-consuming thing, and it still surprised me how time-consuming it is. How much, just like you'll spend 2 hours writing a paragraph describing some part of your game and just going over it over and over and over again and trying to make it perfect. And I think I'm at the point where, with the design of the game and with the Kickstarter, where we're like 90% of there. I think we could get to 100%, but to get to 100% would take probably 100 years. So it's kind of balancing that equation and making sure you're not putting way too much time to get a percent point better in some quasi way that's hard to measure. So we've written up a lot of the Kickstarter text. We have the whole video planned out. And now it's just more about executing on it. So it's more about the graphic design is I'm hoping the graphic designers who's working on the cards, I'm hoping she'll be available to help out with that. And then the video editor, kind of just executing on. We have a lot of stuff planned, making it happen. But yeah, I guess to answer your question, it's just like how long it all takes, especially just doing it part time. It does take a long time, but at the same time, I don't need to release it at any particular point. I'm just really pushing to make it happen. Yeah, very time consuming.
Yeah. And talking about like the Kickstarter, one of the more popular ways for new developers to kind of like fall on their sword when it comes to Kickstarter has to be with stretch goals and the reward tiers. And I mean, we have certainly seen developers either overpromise or just completely kill their budget on crazy rewards as well. I guess for you, with One Last Job, how are you approaching things from like a reward and the stretch goal kind of process?
So let me throw this art back up on the screen. So this was a test to this piece, this cowboy. Mm-hmm. And the goal of this piece was, well, he's one of the characters in the game we needed to produce anyway, but it might be not too obvious, but this is actually a picture of me. So what we did is, let me bring up the reference, and this connects with your question. But we decided we wanted to make it so that one of our rewards is going to be people can pay a little bit extra and they can get their art into the game. They could get their depiction onto one of the pieces of art. So what we did here is, let's see if I can find the right piece. I think it was this one. I posed for it, and there you go. Yeah, so that's just me in my living room. But what we're hoping is one of the rewards is people can pay a little bit extra and give us their depiction. We'll work with them, we'll find a good character, and we'll put them into the game in this way. So this piece right here was just a test to see how one of our artists can do that, and I think it turned out pretty good. It's not 100%, but it's pretty close. So that's going to be one of our rewards, and that one's pretty simple because it's really just kind of coordinating with whoever wants this reward, and we'll have a limited number too. We can't do unlimited of this because we only have a certain number of characters in the game that will even be appropriate to match up with someone. But this is one of the things that we're going to do as a reward that I'm pretty excited about because it's just fun. I don't know. Yeah. This is just kind of silly, and yeah. So otherwise, I think our rewards are going to be pretty minimal. We were talking about, as a stretch goal, having like a plastic insert for the game. Those cost money to produce, and if we get enough copies, the kind of economies of scale kicks in. We can start to improve the box itself in various ways. So we're going to look for some practical ways to make our stretch goals work for people, and try and find stretch goals that are going to be exciting. And we're talking about having little figurines. It might just be meeples, because one of the mechanics in the game, even though it's a card game, we can have sort of a figure for one of the cards. It's just kind of the way the game works out. And so we might do something like that, either as silly as a miniature, or maybe just a kind of meeple with some artwork on it. So we're considering a lot of options like that. But yeah, like I said, the stretch goals and rewards can be pretty minimal, just because this is all very time consuming,
and to keep it small as well.
Yeah, we're trying to keep it, relatively cheap. The artwork is one of the more expensive costs, so we're trying to make sure it can be funded.
Mm-hmm. And I'm going to say this, if you haven't done it yet, that picture of you with the gun in the bag, that will make like the perfect like Facebook profile page or something like that. Should be like on the Kickstarter, like before and after.
Yeah, I've had a friend suggest I reprint out my business cards with that piece,
yes.
And that's not bad. Yeah, we'll definitely feature it on the Kickstarter page with that before after, just so that was the intent of this piece, was to show people. We're trying to figure out if this is doable to have depictions in the game and showing people it.
Mm-hmm. Now, I guess another question for you, another Kickstarter-related question. In terms of, some of the things that you've done, like in the last few months, in terms of getting ready for it, where you said, of course, that you're hopefully planning on and you said January or?
Yeah, I'm very much pushing for January.
Mm-hmm. I guess one of the toughest questions, I know this is one that I've spoken to several developers about, is knowing when the game is ready for Kickstarter. When you're at that point in development when you can say, we have enough to go. Because there are certainly very interesting discussions about either going too early, that you don't have enough to show, or you're going too late and you can't really be adaptable from that Kickstarter side. So I guess for you, especially this being your first big Kickstarter project, how are you coming up with, the goals to say that we're ready for Kickstarter?
Sure, yeah. One of them was the artwork. So I really wanted to make sure we had a sort of signature piece of art to show off each faction in the game. We have 3 factions on each side, so we have 6 factions in the game. And I really wanted an identifying piece of art for each of those factions. So when I organize anything, I usually create a Google Doc. So I created a Google Doc of sort of our art dependencies and started filling that out. I wanted a piece of art for each type of card in the game to demonstrate the different types of cards. So it was kind of a matter of just visualizing the Kickstarter page in some way, looking through other Kickstarter pages, how do they show off their cards. And so it was a matter of kind of making sure we have all of our bases covered in terms of what we want to show about the game on the page. And we can't produce all the artwork yet because it's just a huge number of artwork. So it was making sure that we're investing a little bit now on the front end and making sure that each piece we produce is really demonstrating something core about the game for the Kickstarter page. So on the art level, that's kind of how we broke it down and thought through it. And we're very near completion on our art. I think I have 2 pieces out there that are kind of a work in progress, and I'm working with a couple artists to complete.
All right. And please correct me if I'm wrong if you mentioned this before, Brian, but in terms of the actual design of One Last Job, is there an actual board that you're playing the game on, or is it all strictly done with the cards themselves?
So it's just the cards themselves. There's kind of different zones in the game where you play cards, but those zones are all constructed with cards. So we kind of have locations in the game you play cards to and move cards to, and but all of those pieces are cards.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. For those of you watching this live, we're going to be moving on probably in the next minute to our final topic for the evening. But for you, Brian, are there any aspects of the Kickstarter side of things that we didn't mention that you'd like to bring up?
Oh, geez. I think it was pretty thorough. Nothing's coming to mind.
Okay. All right. So with that, I know it is about 7:30 my time. I think it's. Are you an hour behind me, or I forget
it's 4:30 right now.
All right, so you're 3 hours. I always have trouble with the time differences there, but I know you do have to get going in the next 30 minutes, so we'll move on to our final topic, and then we'll say goodnight for our chat. But again, it's been a pleasure hanging out with you, Brian, and hopefully we can chat closer, or maybe even into the new year, to talk more about the Kickstarter at that point.
Yeah, I'm sure maybe once it goes live, it'll be interesting to maybe have a discussion at that point
Yeah.
and see how it's going.
All right. So with that said, for our final topic, and we're going to probably keep this relatively light, at least for where we're at right now, it's just going to be a little chat about some of the work you've done in terms of participating in game jams. Because game jams have certainly come a long way, especially since I've seen them. Like, I think I did one maybe early thousands, but I know they've been around
Oh,
for a
wow.
while.
Right.
So I guess for you, like, what have you been doing in terms of game jams lately?
So, yeah, just for someone who might not be familiar,
Mm-hmm.
a game jam is it's an opportunity for developers to come together, usually on a weekend, and you're often given some sort of theme. One of the themes that I really liked a long time ago was deception, just to give you an idea. But themes are very broad in what they can be. I just did one recently that was based on the XKCD webcomic. So that's another example. But sometimes it's a solo thing where you just work on your own. Sometimes it's in physical space. Sometimes it's on the internet. And I really like it when it's thought of as a jam, like a musician's jam, where musicians come together and play. It's non-competitive. So some game jams are, put together as a competitive thing. I really like the ones that are, where you can just kind of get up and take a break and go talk to people and help them with their project in some way. Maybe they have a programming issue I can help them with, or an artist comes over and contributes a piece to us. And so that's kind of the idea with game jams. They're super fun to contribute towards if you're interested in game development. I definitely recommend going to one. Have some basic skill you can contribute, but sometimes that skill can just be like production help, helping a team make sure everything's coming together right, or working in paint to create some little pieces of art that can go into a game, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, yeah, so recently at the start of the year, I was part of the Global Game Jam, which I've done probably 6 times at this point. That's always in towards the end of January, so coming up. And this is it's huge. It's very likely that wherever you are, there's a global game jam happening within an hour or two from your house. So I definitely recommend looking that one up. I'll be contributing to that one again in January if I'm trying to get into the Unity space in San Francisco, which has filled up apparently. But yeah, that's a massive game jam. Usually just dozens of people working in the same space, and super fun. And recently I was in the XKCD game jam, which I did on my own, which I don't usually do. I usually have a team I'm working with. So this one was a solo thing, and had a lot of fun with that one as well.
All right. And there are, as you said, there's different game jams based on different themes. There's some that are based on different work that you get done. I think you mentioned, I think in our email as well, that you did one that was just about you doing programming, like for a game jam. Was that right?
Yeah, at the start of the year, I worked. It was funny how it worked out. The venue I was at only had about 6, 7 people show up, so we all just kind of formed one team, and I was the only programmer there out of the 7 of us. So I really just decided to be hands off with anything that wasn't programming, and just went in the tank for the full weekend, just programming and having things thrown at me and getting them into the game and bringing everything together, but letting other people do the design and the artwork and all of that was actually pretty freeing, not having to think about things like design, just make it happen. But yeah, I also do very much like the design side of things as well.
Yeah. And as I was sort of saying in chat, one of the great things about game jams is basically that kind of focused creativity that you see out of a game jam that can lead to some very unexpected game ideas and concepts. I know there's been many games that have came out of game jam concepts. I'm just having trouble thinking of some of the most notable ones off the top of my head. The only one that's coming to mind, I think, was Super Hot, but maybe you can think of
Ah,
some more as well.
geez, I'm trying to think of some right
I
now.
know there's just
No,
like
I know
so many.
it's very true. A lot of especially. Oh, one that comes to mind is Double Fine.
Oh
They're
yeah,
a developer here in San Francisco, and they do what they call the Fortnite every
oh
couple
yeah,
of years or so.
the
So
Amnesia Fortnite. Yeah.
Amnesia Fortnite, yeah, they take 2 weeks and they split up into different teams and they work on a bunch of games. And I don't know one in particular. Maybe Headlanders came from that. I can't remember. I
I
know a
think
couple of their games at least have.
I think the one that they did that was like the strategy game, Brutal Massive
Oh,
Chalice.
Legend. Oh, Massive
I
Chalice. Yeah, that could be
think
right.
that was, yeah.
Yeah. They also
And
had that spaceship colony game. Oh, I'm trying to remember the name of it.
Deep Space, no, was it Deep Space? I own it. I should actually know this. That's the worst part. Let me see.
You know what I'm talking about. I'm sure
Oh
some.
yeah.
Yeah. So if Fortnite comes to mind, that they have that as just an internal thing within their company that they. But that's they're a pretty big studio and very influential. So I'm sure a lot of other studios do this type of thing that maybe we don't even hear about. But a lot of indie PC games come out of maybe Surgeon Simulator, I think, is another one that started off as a game jam and now is this massive success.
Yeah. And I just looked up, it was Space Base DF9.
That's it. Yeah.
And Oscar mentioned Nuclear Throne from Vlambeer was also from a game jam.
Vlambeer, I don't know a whole lot about, but they have this one of them. I'm forgetting his name right now. Jans, the programmer on the team. Well, I think the programmer. He gave this talk at, I don't know, some conference about sort of game feel. It's called The Art of the Screen Shake, and definitely worth watching. But they have that kind of approach to making games. He said that they usually spend, I think he said a couple days making a game, and then they spend a year polishing that game. But they kind of like their games, they create very quickly, at least the basic idea, the basic mechanics, maybe a few levels, and then they spend a year just polishing it and making it all come together into the finished product that we're all used to. But so game jams can be very lucrative in that sense. A lot of people are using them to actually produce commercial stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yep, and it's very interesting about how much things have grown over the last decade, or actually over the last 20 years at this point, in terms of more recognition and more notoriety that comes out of it. I guess for you, Brian, for anyone watching this, especially for like students or first timers, besides the Global Game Jam, are there any other like big name ones for people to look out for if they would like to participate?
The one that comes to mind, it's an online. So Global Game Jam is a physical space jam. You go somewhere and you're there for the week and working, whatever. Just general advice: get sleep. Don't stay up the whole time. Get like 7-8 hours sleep each night. It'll actually pay off and you'll do better work. But anyway, another one that comes to mind is called Ludum Dare.
Oh yeah.
So it's Ludum Dare. You'll find it, but that's an online competition. I think it's generally solo, but they have team projects for Ludum Dare as well. I think one's coming up if it hasn't already started. So I've never contributed to a Ludum Dare myself, but that one is, I know, very popular for online game jams.
Mm-hmm. Yep, definitely. I
think that the number one thing I like about game jams, and I think especially for a student or someone just interested in the process of making a game, is just what it feels like to actually complete a game. It's pretty easy to start making games. I've started to make, probably dozens, if not hundreds of games at this point, but I've completed very few of them. So a game jam is great because you have a deadline, you have a team around you that's all kind of working together, pushing on that deadline. And at the end of it, you'll have a finished game, like out of necessity. You have to submit it by a certain time. Mm-hmm. It'll be finished. It'll be imperfect and maybe even bad. But just going through that, it's often, we kind of joke in the game industry that, you spend 90%. How do we phrase it? The last 10% of the game takes 90% of the time. Mm-hmm. Like you'll complete most of the game, and then that last 10% is where you spend all of your time. So I think it's good to have practice at finishing a game, and a game jam is perfect for that because it's just a weekend rather than this thing that goes on for months and months and months.
Yeah, I've heard of another one. I think, like, isn't there one that you're actually doing like on a train? Like you're like everyone just like gets
train jam. Yeah, so this is I don't know. It's probably like 4 or 5 years old at this point, but it starts off in Chicago, and then for the week or a few days leading up to GDC, which happens in March here in San Francisco, people get on a train and take the train across the country. A person I know, a former colleague, he is from San Francisco, lives in San Francisco. He flew to Chicago, got on a train, worked on a game until he got to San Francisco again. So it's people do it. I've never done that one, but that's one you can look up. Another thing that comes to mind is if you go to itch.io, that site is kind of the Steam of indie games is the best way to describe it. But they have a list of game jams. So I'm on a mailing.
Cool. 1 second there. For those guys, for anyone watching this live, did we just get cut off for any reason? I just got some kind of alert about OBS getting knocked out.
Hmm.
If anyone, please let me know if that last part what we just talked about did get cut out, and we'll just have to repeat that last part. But while we're waiting, or actually, I'll get to your question in a second, Mike. But to start to wrap things up, at least on game jams, I guess one thing that I've always had trouble with is getting like groups together for them. Are there any like well-known or reputable sites when it comes to just being able to, meet around, say I want to join this one, and we find like-minded people?
So I encourage people to go to a game jam without a team, even, and just if it's a physical space game jam, a big part of that is linking people up into teams once you get there. So on that level, I'd even encourage you not to even bring a team, but you can if you want. For the online jam, I contributed. I was part of I think 2 weekends ago. They organized on Discord. They had a Discord channel, and the person who ran it, Xavier, his name was, I'm forgetting his last name, but he put it all together in Discord. He used a site called CrowdForge, so that's something you could look into to organize teams. But it was all very well run through itch.io and the Discord channel, and it had structure for you to find a team and find people if you wanted.
Okay, cool. I guess with that, I know we are starting to get near the end in terms of time. Are any other topics relating to game jams you want to bring up, Brian?
I'd say there's just the art side of it, which another good thing about game jams is you can usually get away with pretty minimal art, and so you could get pretty creative with it. There's some great tools now that will help you if you're not even artistically inclined create art. Magic of Voxel comes to mind, is a great tool to look into to create 3D or even 2D characters and props and whatever. But yeah, that's one thing that comes to mind. But otherwise, no, I think we've covered the basics.
All right. I think YouTube may be having some trouble. 1 second. Test. Can you guys still hear us right now? I wonder if YouTube or OBS or something is starting to mess up, which is actually a good time to wrap it up. As a precaution, I just turned on the recording just in case. I think we're still good though, but all right. I think it's hard to tell, but I think we should be wrapping up. Let's get to Mike's question, and then we'll say goodnight, just in case things are starting to get all messy here. But Mike's question is, do you have any advice on how to deal with trolls or toxic behavior, if you have anything there?
Geez, I guess I've been somewhat lucky, or maybe I'm just not big enough to get a lot of that. So, I've got some comments in the past that were maybe a little bit rude, or I wouldn't call them toxic or trolls, but just my immediate reaction is to kind of like defend myself, but I've learned a lot recently how to avoid being defensive and try and just see it from their perspective. I had someone comment recently about a game I worked on, and they're kind of missing the main point of it, and I could have just been like, "Oh, you're such an idiot! Don't you see how this?" But I instead kind of just broke it down for them in a kind way, and was patient. And I don't know. I think if something really pisses you off, the worst thing you can do is respond harshly. I think that you either don't respond or try and be nice about it, and don't be passive aggressive, and just I put the energy out there that you want to get back, maybe. But yeah, I don't have a lot of experience with it, luckily.
All right. That is fine. So I know you got to go in the next 20 minutes, and it seems like we could probably sit here and chat for another hour. But let's wrap things up here for this evening. So I guess my final question then for you, Brian, is do you have any final thoughts on One Last Job, Kickstarter, or anything you would like to kind of like wrap the cast up on?
That's a good question. I've been working on One Last Job so long. It's hard to be self-inspective about it right now. Is that a word, inspective?
Introspective?
Introspective. Maybe that's the word I'm trying to say. No, I mean, it's hard to think of something on the fly like that. Nothing's coming to mind.
All right. I think with that, again, we could easily segue or go back to any one of our talks, especially the one about aesthetics. I think that is a very fascinating discussion to be had. But I know you have to go in now 16 minutes, so we'll wrap things up for this evening. And again, we can always chat again in the future. So
this jumps out at me really quick.
Okay.
Let me do a share screen thing again. I just realized a small little detail. In this version of the piece of art, we realized the hat was too difficult to make out, so we just kind of changed the color a bit.
Oh yeah.
We made it like kind of a little bit purple or whatever. I don't know why I thought that was interesting. I just was looking at that art.
All right. Well, I think with that, it is time to say goodnight. Brian, if you wouldn't mind hanging on for Skype like 1 minute after we turn
Sure.
off the stream, just want to talk to you about a few things. But we are going to end things here for this week's cast. So, again, Brian, thank you so much for coming on. Definitely the best of luck with One Last Job. And we'll be sure, hopefully, to follow up with you in January when hopefully the Kickstarter is up.
Thanks for having me on, and thanks all the people that were submitting questions. Oscar, I forget the other people's names.
Mike.
But Mike,
Yeah.
Thank you for the questions and watching.
Yep. And for those of you watching this record, if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments, and I'll send them over to Brian when we chat on Twitter. But
Sure.
with that said, we're going to end things here. For those of you watching this live, there will be a regular stream later tonight around our usual time. But for those of you who've been enjoying this, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel. If you'd like to support Game Wisdom, check out patreon.com/gwbicer to find out how, as well as access to our private Discord channel and more. And definitely, if you are a developer or someone who'd like to come on and talk about game design, we're always looking for new guests, be it for live cast or our recording. So please don't hesitate to get in touch. But otherwise, be sure to check out One Last Job, especially as we get further into development. I'll include any links to places you'd like me to, Brian, in the description below, so be sure to check that out. But otherwise, thanks for tuning in. Hopefully my fire alarm won't go off or the police will come blaring down the street. But let's wrap it up now. So thanks again for tuning in, and I will catch you all later tonight and whenever we do another live stream. Until then, have a good night, everybody.
Thanks for having me.
Mm-hmm.